Hey everyone, welcome back to the Brilliance of Humanity Summit. I don't know about you, but just when I think those conversations can't get any better, here comes another speaker, and we just keep building and building and building. And I mean, my brain is like, oh, there's so much great information. And speaking of these amazing conversations we've been having, it is my pleasure to welcome today Kelly Leiseth. Kelly, welcome to the Brilliance of Humanity Summit.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, we are going to have so much fun. Kelly, I'm just going to give people a little bit of background on you. You are with KJL Consulting, and you really specialize in a couple of different things. One is collaborative problem solving, and the other is really these conversations that matter, these conversations that take people places, and even having some of these hard conversations. And when you and I were talking about what you could come on here and talk about, we were like, wait a minute, what about a conversation that will rebuild humanity? And we were both like, ooh, it was like mic drop moment, right? For us.
Yeah.
Like, that's
Right.
it,
Yeah.
that's it. So Kelly, you also are a teacher. Like, you do so much. You do the consulting, you do the teaching. I
hmm
am actually curious, before we really branch into this secret sauce around this conversation that can rebuild humanity, how did you get interested in really pursuing conversations as something to be consulting about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been an educator for 12 years, and of those 12 years, 11 of them have been in special education. And I switched roles a little bit about 6 years ago. And now I work exclusively with residential care and treatment students. And so these are the bad kids, right? Like these are the worst of the worst. Like they are sent there like through court orders, through truancy issues, discipline, challenging behaviors. Just these kids are the hard kids, right? And so I was a year into that and I had that one kid. Like I chose to work with the hard students, but I had this one kid that was just so hard. Like I could not I tried all the things that you could think of, all the tools in my toolbox, and like nothing was getting solved. He still had behaviors. He'd be really good for like a day cuz the sticker chart would work. And then the next day he'd like blow up over something or he'd cuss me out or he'd throw something. I'm just like, this kid, I don't know what else to do with you. I've done everything that I know. And so I attended a workshop, and you go to a workshop, you go to a conference, there's breakout sessions, and you literally just pick one that you think sounds good based off a little description. And so I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, this one sounds good. Collaborative problem solving, rethinking challenging behavior. I was like, what? I've got challenging behavior with this kid. Maybe this is something. And it was a 4-hour session. I'm sitting there and I'm like, why did I pick a 4-hour session out of all the other ones? And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, this guy's talking. And I'm just like, oh, this was a bad idea. And then he starts saying stuff. I'm just like, this is what I'm missing. And like it just spoke to my heart of like, this is what I'm missing with these challenging kids. And it's really focusing on that they're not trying to behave badly. They're not trying to wake up. They're not waking up that day and being like, I'm going to make her life miserable because I'm going to throw a pencil at her and I'm going to call her really nasty names. So then, like, that's my goal for today. They don't wake up like that. They just don't have the skills to handle expectations that we place on them. And so like once my whole mindset shifted towards that and really learning how to have a empathetic conversation, like my entire world has changed. So that's why I'm here, is looking to change the world one conversation at a time.
Oh my gosh, I love looking to change the world one conversation at a time. And what I also love is that you just brought up the E word, empathy.
Yeah.
And from the conversations you and I actually had prior to getting on and talking and having this conversation, you were like, Deb, it's all about the empathy. If we
hmm
could actually bring back the empathy piece, that is what would shift the conversations. Talk to me about that, and let's give empathy its moment.
Right. Absolutely. So the whole point of our conversations is really to learn their perspective, like empathy, right? Trying to understand where they're coming from around a problem. And once we can like find out what their concern is about a problem, then we can work towards the solution, right? Like, for example, I had a student who was really, really angry at me for wanting to do yoga one day. You know, yoga is a calming activity, just in the dark, just kind of hanging out, doing some stretching. Like, I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. And he's like, and he blew up on me, just completely blew up. Like, I'm not doing this, started cussing, walked out of the room, like, just lost it. I'm like, over yoga? Like, what in the world is, why? And then I'm like, stop. Wonder what his perspective is. I wonder why he's feeling like this. So we had the conversation. He goes, I don't want to be embarrassed in front of my peers. I'm like, oh, I get it. Like, I don't want to be embarrassed in front of my colleagues either. Like, I totally understand now. I'm feeling that empathy of knowing where you're coming from. And now this concern that I had of you blowing up and walking away and you concerned about being embarrassed, like now we have these two perspectives on the table and we can work through this.
Hmm.
So that's just, the empathy piece is just a huge part of the conversation.
So I'm almost wondering if it might not be useful to explore what has gotten in the way of empathy. Like, why are we a culture that is starving for empathy?
hmm in my opinion, I think it's because we assume what the other person is already thinking because that's how we would react. And so I
Mm.
mean, like, just um, we put our thoughts and our perspectives on somebody else, and we assume it's the same. When in reality, it's usually something completely different.
Yes, I kind of often refer to that term as like, oh, yeah, I'm trying to read your mind and see what you're thinking. And
hmm
when I make those assumptions or I make up what I think that you're thinking and then
Yes.
respond that way, or with my experiences, it might be completely off base.
hmm
And so,
Absolutely.
what is that impact when someone does start making the assumptions or thinks they know what the other person is thinking? What impact has that been creating if they don't know how to have these really awesome conversations?
Right. I think it creates a broken relationship because that understanding, that validation piece isn't there. It's just the assumption that you think that this other person is thinking and feeling this way when in reality it's usually not.
Yeah, and I often am thinking too about like you talk about broken relationships. I'm thinking of friendships that I've seen fall apart because somebody completely misunderstood what was going on. And the other
hmm
thing I'm wondering about in this conversation too, Kelly, is this piece around we really don't know what other people are going through.
Yes,
We think we do, but even two people going through the same thing, how they experience it might be different.
absolutely.
Right. So I'm this empathy piece is starting to make sense because really what I hear you saying is we're really honing in on what's going on across the table for me. What's going on for that person? It's sort of like a curiosity place, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And in education and the trauma piece of things, we call that the invisible backpack, right? Everybody's got this backpack that nobody else can see, and we don't know what they're carrying in that backpack. It could be um, coming from a place that they don't know where they're going to get their next meal. It could be they don't have clean clothes to wear. They woke up to parents fighting that morning. Like, we don't know what's in their backpack, and being curious about their experience and their perspective is absolutely the hugest piece of empathy, in my opinion.
But I love that concept of the invisible backpack. I'd never heard it said that way before. But it's sort of, you hear people say you never know what someone else is going through. The invisible backpack is really a great way to demonstrate we really don't know what someone else is going through or what they've been through and how that's impacting them. That's great. That invisible backpack thing is good. Now I almost wish I had one to hold up here. So I'm curious about how do you start approaching teaching these conversations to people? Is this a specific, oh, let me give you my list of questions to ask? Or is this more about teaching a way of being with people? Maybe it's both.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say it's the latter. It's really a way of being because you are really shifting it. We call it it's an unconventional wisdom, right? The conventional wisdom is that kids do well if they want to. we just have to find their carrot to motivate them to want to do better. That's the conventional wisdom that we're all very familiar with.
Mm.
And collaborative problem solving is that unconventional wisdom that kids do well if they can. And if they can't, then there's something getting in the way of them being able to do well. And so then it's our job as helpers to help figure out what is getting in their way and help them build that skill to be able to do well.
And I would imagine this is not just an overnight thing. This probably takes some time. How long does it generally take from the time you start working on these skills till people actually feel pretty comfortable with them?
I would say it varies from person to person. It really comes back to that empathy piece, because once you are able to recognize your own skills that you're not very good at, then you're able to see in other people of like, wow, that makes sense. They lost their car keys because their working memory isn't the greatest, and so that's why they're super grumpy. I totally get that. I understand that when I'm frustrated because I lose my car keys, I know what that feels like. And so then having that empathy piece, again, tying back to that, is that that's where that mind shift really starts to change, instead of like, oh, you lost your car keys and now you're grumpy. Like, so what? Get over it.
Mm. It's so makes sense. And I even think about myself, like if I've had a lost my car keys day, right? And then I encounter an individual who maybe isn't necessarily being as kind to me. I just want to say, I lost my car keys. I this, I that, like, right? Like it's almost like I want to say, can you just give me a break? And there's
Hmm.
sort of that, which now is leading me to this curiosity around what about the empathy we have for ourselves? Because I'm wondering if these skills can apply because we can be pretty hard on ourselves, Kelly.
Absolutely. So we break it down into 5 categories of thinking skills, right? We have attention working memory, language and communication, emotional regulation, social thinking skills, and cognitive flexibility. And like as an adult, as I'm reading myself in these skills of like, wow, my language and communication skills are really hard for me in a lot of different situations. So then you're like, okay, now I understand, like when I'm at a staff meeting and they call my name to say something, like I get red and I start sweating. I'm like, what is my mouth going to say that my brain should be saying? Like all those things, like, oh yeah, because I don't have very good skills in that area. So I avoid them. And then all these feelings come up and everyone's just sitting there staring at me like, why is she not talking? So yeah, having that self-compassion. And now what's really cool is like when I go to groups and I do trainings and that kind of stuff, I'm very transparent and vulnerable with them. And I'm like, hey, I'm sorry. Sometimes that things that come out of my mouth are not what I meant to say. So please just ask me for clarification when I say something and you're like, what did she just say? And they're like, oh, and I'm like, have a little grace with me sometimes, and they usually are very much so of like, "Oh, yeah, you're good, we got you, you don't need to worry." So, absolutely recognizing those skills in yourself has been a huge in just being able to build your own ability to have conversations with others.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up grace. I think about grace, I think about forgiveness, I think about mercy, and I feel like next to empathy, those are three things that I just feel like we have forgotten.
Mhm.
And when we can really give ourselves grace and also others grace, it opens up the space for everyone. And I know I use the word sometimes like I'm going to tell on myself, like, oh, I'm going to tell myself because I was feeling this way or I did this thing. And it's amazing how all of a sudden people start going, oh, yeah, that's happened to me too. It's like, oh, there's
Yep.
full on permission now to admit,
Mhm.
oh, what, that you're a human being?
Yeah,
Yeah, like
exactly.
what we got to just bring up the P word. So, how does perfectionism get in the way of empathy or get in the way of grace or get in the way of self-compassion? There has to be a role for it somewhere in here.
Oh, I believe that there's absolutely a role in just the whole conversation piece, because there is a flow to having, a collaborative problem-solving conversation, um, and a lot of people get stuck because they think they have to do it perfectly, and we always say there's no such thing as a failed conversation. And people
Mm,
are like, "But I didn't follow the ingredients. I didn't follow," we call them ingredients, the steps to the conversation. "I didn't follow the steps correctly, or I didn't do this, or I did this instead of this." And I'm like, "It's okay. You can't fail a conversation." And
mm.
so that's it. Definitely, like, the perfectionism piece definitely gets in the way of people really embracing and implementing these types of strategies.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about how you are implementing your work in the world. I hear you talking about obviously directly with your own students or people you're working with, but in this consulting role, you are now educating and facilitating workshops for others to learn the skills. So talk to us about what that looks like.
Yeah, so there I have a couple different options. Like, we can do just a general introduction, like just getting your feet wet into this brand new model, this approach. And then we have different tiers of levels of training that people can attend and go through, and then I work with them. And then I have follow-up coaching with that, because we all know that, like, you go to a training, you get really fired up, and you're like, "This is awesome, I love these things." And then the next day, you're like, "Yeah, it was a good day." And then you go about your business. And so we know that the implementation shows that if you have a coach and a mentor guiding you through these things while you're doing them, the success rate is so much higher. So that's a big part of it. Like, the training piece is important, of course, just for delivering the content and the knowledge. But it's that follow up in the trenches pieces that I enjoy the most.
Yeah, and so as you're talking about this, I'm picturing the type of people you might work with. I'm envisioning you're working with schools. Maybe you're working with social workers, even. I can visualize that that could be a thing. And parents.
Absolutely, we have a whole
Oh,
separate parent curriculum. Yep.
yeah. Like I'm like, where was this when I was having young adult? Where, right? Like this could have been so useful.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, what do you notice like when you work with educators and maybe work with parents? Are there any differences with working with those different groups, or is it really about the skill set and it's pretty much the same?
It correlates a lot together. There are some differences, obviously. Like, the problems that we're solving at school is, keeping hands to self and staying in the classroom and being kind with your words to others. Whereas home, like with my own children, the problems we've solved have gone around getting dressed in the morning, why we need to brush our teeth, why we need to eat at the table and not on the couch. You know what I mean? Like, they're the same skills and they're transferable. Because when we're talking about these things, they're real world things. It's not like go sit in a therapist's office and like talk about them and then go do them. It's like, all right, we are standing in the bathroom, toothbrush in hand. I see you're having a hard time. Let's talk about it. And so the skills are very much so the same. It's just applying it to brushing teeth versus why we don't throw pencils at our friends.
I love it. And I'm curious about as you are were doing this work in the world, is there a time where you just kind of sat back and went, "Oh my gosh, this really works?" Or like where you just had that aha I call it like the gold moment or like the eureka. It's like, "Oh my gosh, this is so the thing." Um
Mhm.
has that happened or is it still in progress happening?
Yes, and it's actually happened twofold for me personally. One, is one of my students. He had a lot of emotional regulation difficulties, and anytime he heard the word no, he would just lose it, cussing, swearing, "I'm gonna leave this place. I'm gonna run away," and he actually has run away a couple times. Um, but once we started having these conversations and he's involved with the problem solving process, he hasn't gotten in any fights. He used to be very physical in his altercations. He has not run away for almost 3 years. And he is now recognizing, like, hey, that really made me upset. Can we talk about it? Versus just, calling everybody all the names and just yelling at people for what appeared to be no reason. So, like, seeing the success with him has been amazing. And then just like statistics, right? When I first started, we had a 40% removal rate from the program. So that was either law enforcement involvement, basically discharged from the program because they did something like really bad. Um, and we are now we are at 0.03% removal rate.
Oh my
So
gosh, Kelly, that's amazing.
yeah, so I mean, between the real world, like seeing his growth, and then our data of like we have not had a student removed in the last 2 years, and so it's both those pieces where I've seen incredible transformation.
Oh wow, this is huge. Like this is huge. So of course, you know me, I'm like, everybody needs to know about you. We need to care. So because what I also just heard in that you mentioned law enforcement, and that is probably another group of individuals that this type of methodology training, I could see it being incredibly useful. Really, who couldn't benefit from this? I mean, let's really get real about this. Because
Mhm,
if we sit there and talk about the need for empathy and conversations, and why that truly can rebuild humanity,
mhm.
doesn't it make sense that we could all benefit from doing this?
Absolutely, and a huge piece of the conversation piece is the ability to rebuild those helping relationships. Like all those relationships that have been damaged because behavior is really just an unmet expectation. Like if I have an expectation for my husband to do the dishes while I run to the grocery store, but I don't tell him that that's my expectation, and then I come home and they're not done and I get mad, like that behavior is on me because I had an unmet expectation that I didn't explain. And so it's definitely restoring those helping relationships when it comes to behavior and unmet expectations.
Yeah. I so love that you're bringing up the E word expectations because do you feel like, or do you notice that expectations can really lead us down a road like, "Eh," because we have these
Yeah.
expectations? Talk to me a little bit about that and where you tend to see that showing up the most.
Where I see it the most is they're not clear and concise expectations that are taught. Like, for example, we had a little first grader who had a really, really hard time transitioning down the hallway. And I asked the teacher, I said, "What's the expectation?" And she said, "Walking feet." And I'm like, okay, as an adult, I understand what walking feet means. Like you walk on your feet down the hallway to get to where you need to go. And so I asked him, I said, what's going on? What's going on with walking feet? And he goes, "Well, that's boring." I'm like, okay. He wanted to have lizard walking feet because he was crawling on the floor like a lizard. And I'm like, oh, well, the expectation of walking feet was never clear, it wasn't concise, and it wasn't taught. And so it's like, of course, he's not meeting that expectation. And of course, the teacher's upset at his behavior because he's walking like a lizard. And so it's like the whole expectation piece of if you don't understand what your expectation is, then how can you expect other people to understand your expectation?
Yeah. Oh, it's so true, Kelly. And let's even think about as adults, we
Mhm.
like have all these things in our mind that we expect other people to do, but they have no clue that we expect them to do that, right?
Absolutely.
And what happens? We get disappointed
Mhm.
when something doesn't meet the expectation, when the other person even has no clue about it. I find this fascinating actually. So I'm sort of curious, like, is this something for you that it's like every time you do the workshop, you're just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I can't believe I get to do this.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's like you get to go do this, you get to practice and really you get to see humanity in a way bigger light. So now let's connect this to the larger humanity piece. And I'm curious about how do we take these? I know you're talking about like making the impact through these single conversations. How do we take this and augment it so that more people get to experience this and actually can even bring that to bigger impact for humanity?
Absolutely. It's just the understanding of that all people are doing the best that they can with the skills that they have. Like I said earlier, just because my language and communication skills aren't the best, but I have really good working memory skills. And if I flip that, my husband has really great language and communication skills, but he's got terrible working memory skills. Like just having that understanding that remembering stuff is hard for him and having that grace, with him, and others knowing that, things are hard for them, they're still trying to do the best that they can. Like, people don't wake up, most people, I will say that, most people don't wake up in the morning intending to go to jail by the end of that day because they didn't do something the way they were supposed to, right? Like, just having that understanding that all people are doing the best that they can with those skills that they have.
Yeah. Something just occurred to me as you were talking, which is this takes some time
Hmm.
and it takes some patience.
Yes.
And I feel like sometimes we live in this world that is so quick to let me drive through fast food. I want to order it now and have it delivered in an hour at my doorstep. And, emotions don't work that way.
Hmm.
And this process doesn't work that way. So I'm almost wondering, how do we bring in this concept of a little more patience, a little more, we talked about grace, but I think it's a grace and that patience, that ability to just kind of like slow it down for a hot minute.
Hmm.
How do we make the value of this? I don't know if it's known, understood, communicated, so that we can give ourselves that permission to be patient, to slow down, and to take the time. What does that look like?
For me, I think it looks like people willing to be a little bit vulnerable, of really understanding that emotions are messy, and instead of um, band-aiding things to just get through or get by and just keep ignoring the hard stuff, is just really having that little bit of vulnerability to be able to being open to having the experiences that they may have not experienced before.
Mm. Oh my gosh, I love that. And vulnerability. I so love the conversation of vulnerability, which also leads to the courage, right? And I
Yep.
love
Yep.
how Brene talks about that connection to vulnerability and being courageous. And these are courageous conversations, aren't they?
They're hard. They're definitely hard because in each conversation, you get to work on those skills that are hard for you.
So, speaking of hard conversations, you put together a fun little freebie for everybody, 5 tips to having hard conversations. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, it's just some 5 tips for having those conversations, staying curious and trying to understand the other person's perspective, the empathy piece of really trying to understand what they're saying, the listening piece, of course, because we are so good at listening to respond, but not necessarily listening for understanding.
Mm.
And then just really willing to have both concerns on the table so then you can move forward towards a solution.
Yeah, I love this. And this is a freebie, folks. So you'll see that information there for you to be able to get this freebie that Kelly has put together for you. I love this 5 tips for having those hard conversations. And let's face it, who could not benefit from having those tips? Like, I think this is really, really important. Kelly, our time has gone so fast, hasn't it?
Yes.
Before we conclude our interview, I would love for you to just share maybe one, 2 things, one thing that we can start doing today to
Mhm.
have these conversations, to get us started today prior to signing up for a training that you're doing, because we're definitely getting people in touch with your website so they can get signed up for an amazing training from you. But I'm curious about something we might be able to start doing even now to
Mhm.
start actually having these conversations that can rebuild humanity.
Absolutely. And the thing that you can start doing right now is being curious. We are so quick to, when our expectation isn't met, going right to furious. Like, why didn't they do that? I thought they were going to do that. They should have done that. Why didn't, like, you can just feel that anger starting to build when you think of something like somebody cut me off on the freeway, right? Like, just mad. A lot of people, not all people. And then if you take a step back and you're curious, like, huh, I wonder why they did that. I wonder if they have wonder if they're late to a meeting. I wonder if they're rushing to get to maybe the hospital for some emergency. Maybe they are on their phone and they didn't pay attention, or maybe they're a brand new driver and just really don't understand road etiquette yet. Like once you start going through those scenarios of maybe and being curious about it, then you're able to access that empathy of like, oh yeah, I've been late to a meeting before too, and I felt so rushed, and I did cut that person off, and I did feel bad, but that it just happened. You know what I mean? Instead of just being automatically like they're out to get me, that person did that to me on purpose, and just, taking a step back, taking a deep breath, regulating your prefrontal cortex a little bit, accessing our logic piece, and being curious instead of just immediately going to furious of like, huh, I wonder why that happened. Or I wonder why they did that. I wonder why they said that.
Oh my gosh, I just love what you just said. Curious, not furious. That's a writer downer. Curious, not furious. Like, write that down, please. It's so good. Kelly, you have been so brilliant. I just want to thank you for being brilliant. I want to thank you for the contributions that you're making to humanity. And I want to thank you for sharing all these incredible insights and tools that we can start doing right now. Thank you so much. And for joining us. This has been a brilliant conversation. You are brilliant. And I want to thank you so much for the contributions that you are making in the world.
Absolutely. I'm so thankful that you asked me to be here today, and I could talk about this stuff for hours.
I know, that's what I was thinking. Like, we could record a whole summit just on what you're doing. You need to do your own summit. That's what needs to happen. Oh my goodness. Well, thanks again for joining us. Friends, I know that you've enjoyed this. Take advantage of that freebie. And boy, if you're out there and you're thinking you need to get your hands on some of this training, you want to get signed up. Maybe you are in a school district and you want to bring this to your school. Maybe you're with a law enforcement center. Get in touch with her. You've got all the details. We want to thank you for being a part of the Brilliance of Humanity Summit. Friends, there's so much more to come. Thank you. And we look forward to bringing more brilliance your way. Have a great day, friends.